what is also interesting in this case is he could attack the firmware and then use that firmware to attack Windows back, escalating his privileges, but also gaining persistence across Windows installs. If Word, for example, had access to the microphone, an attacker who would normally not have access to that microphone could steal that from Word and then reuse that, even though that's considered sensitive on macOS.
Welcome to the Talos Threat Perspective, our regular look at the latest threat trends and attacker tactics. Now, every year, Talos discovers, discloses, and protects against hundreds of previously unknown vulnerabilities. Now, over the last couple of years, the average CVSS score for these vulnerabilities has been around 7.5, which, as most security teams know, is about the point when weekends start to get cancelled. For this episode, we're focused on 3 vulnerabilities that stood out most to us in the past year, not just because of their severity, but what they tell us about current attacker tactics. Now, there is a connective theme between them all as well, because at their core, these vulnerabilities are about boundaries that defenders rely on. But recently, they've started finding ways to push those boundaries. We'll hear directly from Yves Younan, who leads Talos's vulnerability discovery team. We'll unpack what these vulnerabilities mean for defenders, why they matter, and also why they stood out to us, because, as Yves himself put it to me, they're a little off the beaten track. So a little bit more about this team before we get into those top 3 vulnerabilities. Now, they are looking for new vulnerabilities in hardware and software products that are used all over the world. Windows, Adobe Acrobat, that kind of thing.
And we find those vulnerabilities, we make sure there's detection content in place for Cisco security products, and we notify the vendor and work with them to remove those vulnerabilities. Most things we find are remote code executions, because they can be the most devastating attacks that are out there. And the majority of our time is spent on that root cause analysis. So if we fuzz, we get a crash, we have to figure out, is it a real vulnerability or is it just a bug in the program that's not exploitable? So we spend a lot of time figuring out that root cause and then communicating that back to the world.
So while most of the vulnerabilities that Yves' team worked on this year were remote code execution vulnerabilities, the 3 examples that we're highlighting today demonstrate how attackers are willing to get inventive in the pursuit of access. The first involves Dell laptops, where a vulnerability in the security chip could have allowed persistence that survives even a full reinstall of Windows. The second focuses on Microsoft Office for Mac OS, where attackers could borrow sensitive permissions like microphone access from trusted applications such as Microsoft Word. And finally, we'll turn to small office and home routers, which is a favorite staging ground for attackers. But first, let's begin with that Dell research.
Philippe on our team discovered a bunch of vulnerabilities in Dell's security chip that they ship in their laptops. And the interesting part of this one is that we could attack the firmware on that chip and then use that to bypass Windows login, for example. Or what is also interesting in this case is he could attack the firmware and then use that firmware to attack Windows back, escalating his privileges, but also gaining persistence across Windows installs. So let's say the attacker was discovered, people would re-image the laptop to make it more secure. You could hack the laptop again because the firmware on that chip would have been modified to be malicious.
So even if you wiped and reinstalled Windows, the attacker's foothold was still there. Now, we have a great deep dive blog on this vulnerability, how we discovered it, and how we worked to find a fix for it. So do check that out in the description when you get a chance. Now, all of this shows that attackers are willing to go deeper into firmware to stay hidden. Now, that is one end of the spectrum, but attackers can also go wide, finding small gaps in how applications handle permissions and using those to move further than they should. And that is exactly what Yves' team found in Microsoft Office on Mac OS.
What we found interesting here was that they weren't fully implementing the privilege differences on macOS versus Windows correctly on macOS. And this could allow an attacker to, for example, steal the permissions from an application. So if Word, for example, had access to the microphone, an attacker who would normally not have access to that microphone could steal that from Word and then reuse that, even though that's considered sensitive on macOS. And that's interesting because it's a little bit different than what we usually find.
Attackers know that people trust apps like Word, so by doing it this way, they're borrowing its permissions, and suddenly they have access to things like your microphone without even asking you. And if borrowing trust works on a single machine, imagine scaling that up to an entire network, and that is where routers come in.
We find a lot of vulnerabilities in routers, Soho routers mostly. The reason we look at those is because they are often used by attackers as a way of staging attacks. So for example, if you can hack someone's home router and you then attack somebody else, you're coming from what looks like a trusted ISP, right? Like let's use Comcast as an example. Your employees are Comcast customers, so you expect Comcast customers to connect to your VPN. But then attackers can mimic that by attacking those home routers, right? They're also coming from Comcast. So it's a lot harder to block those as a company than it would be to block, say, a whole country, or to block connections from AWS or whatever thing where an attacker could rent space. So that's we find a lot of those vulnerabilities, and we work with vendors to get them fixed because those are such an important platform from which attackers can attack companies or others.
The router isn't the ultimate prize here, it's the disguise. Attackers don't care if it's dusty and humming away in the corner of your office. If it helps them blend in, it's useful. Looked at together, these vulnerabilities show 3 different ways that attackers are trying to test the limits: persistence that survives a reinstall, privileges borrowed from trusted apps, and traffic disguised as normal activity. The 3 variations on the same theme. Attackers are constantly probing the seams where trust, technology, and assumptions don't quite line up. Now, where does that leave defenders? It's not a fun answer, but it does come down to prioritization.
Prioritizing what is the most important vulnerability to patch, because you can't patch everything at the same time. And that is the hard part, right? What do I patch first? There's scoring systems out there, including Cisco, that has one that can help with that. But the most important thing is when those vulnerabilities are discovered and patched, like what we do, make sure to actually apply those patches, because otherwise you're leaving yourself open to attack.
Huge thanks to Eve and the team for their work on these vulnerabilities. You can keep up to date with all of the vulnerabilities that our team writes about on the Talos blog. And of course, all of those blogs contain instructions on what to do if any of these vulnerabilities might affect your organization. So if you head to blog.talosintelligence.com, you can also follow our vulnerability roundup series. It's well worth a follow. If you subscribe to our weekly Threat Source newsletter as well, that is where we highlight a lot of this research. So until next time, thank you for watching and take care.